It began with silence, the kind of silence that creeps before the slaughter, that wraps itself around the bones of a city waiting to die. Jerusalem, holy, ancient, proud, stood on the edge of annihilation. Her walls cracked, her people starved, her gods weeping from heavens that refused to intervene. And then came the crosses. 1, 10, 50, hundreds, then thousands. They rose like cursed trees, planted not in soil but in flesh, nailed not with purpose but with punishment. Each one held a man, writhing, moaning, praying, or worse, still, silent, waiting to die under a sun that burned without mercy. It was 70 AD. The Roman general Titus had besieged Jerusalem for months, and as the gates held and the defenders resisted, Titus unleashed a new form of warfare. Psychological, surgical, sadistic. Crucifixion wasn't merely a death sentence. It was a message. Escape, and this is your fate. Resist, and your family watches you rot. Defy Rome, and your final breath will be gasped on splintered wood beneath a sky that forgets your name. Ancient historian Flavius Josephus wrote that so many people were crucified during the siege that there was no room for the crosses and no crosses for the bodies. Think about that. No room for death. And yet death came again and again. This wasn't just war, it was extermination. This wasn't justice, it was spectacle. And the man orchestrating it, Titus, would later be honored with parades, statues, and triumphal arches. But no monument bears the faces of those he crucified. No records give their names, no prayers mark their graves. So we ask, why did Titus crucify them in such numbers? What made him turn a sacred city into a forest of agony? And what does it mean when the state uses torture, not for interrogation, but for intimidation? This is the untold story of the crucifixions under Titus, a tale of hunger, fire, and bodies nailed in defiance of silence. A story buried beneath centuries of ash, but not forgotten. Let's begin. Jerusalem had seen war before, but never like this. In the spring of 70 AD, the city was encircled by 4 Roman legions, nearly 60,000 men under the command of Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian. The Jewish revolt that had begun 4 years earlier was in its death throes, and Titus was the hammer coming down on its final breath. Inside the walls were the defenders, zealots, rebels, fathers with kitchen knives, sons with nothing to lose. But they weren't unified. Jerusalem's factions, Sicarii, zealots, remnants of the priesthood, fought one another as viciously as they fought Rome. Food stores were burned, not by invaders, but by rival Jews. The enemy was both at the gates and within. Titus began with patience. He built siege ramps. He launched firebrands. He cut off every road leading into the city. No one got in, no one got out. What followed wasn't battle, it was starvation. Within weeks, famine sank its claws into the population. Grain ran out, oil ran out, water grew scarce. People searched refuse piles for seeds, chewed leather belts, scraped moss from stones, mothers boiled shoe leather. Then, in what Josephus called madness from hunger, came the most unspeakable act, a mother who cooked her own infant and ate him. When rebels discovered the remains, they recoiled in horror, not at the act, but because she had nothing left to steal. Jerusalem had become something less than human, and all the while Titus watched, waiting, listening to the wind carry screams across his camp, sending scouts to count the dead, and preparing the next phase, not just destruction, but degradation. He ordered that any who tried to flee be captured, not just detained, not executed quickly. They would be crucified, publicly, slowly, until every starving soul within the walls knew there was no escape. From this moment forward, Jerusalem would not just be a battlefield, it would be a gallery of agony. They came at night, emaciated figures, little more than shadows, slipping out of Jerusalem's gates under the cloak of darkness. men, women, even children, hoping to find food, mercy, anything beyond the slow death that waited inside. Their faces were gaunt, bellies sunken, fingers trembling as they clawed through Roman trenches, searching for roots, crumbs, scraps of discarded rations. They were not rebels, they were not soldiers. They were desperate. But to the Romans, desperation was defiance, and defiance demanded a lesson. Titus didn't offer them food. He offered them wood and nails. Each night, the captives were dragged back to the Roman lines, where soldiers, numbed by routine, hoisted timber, drove spikes, and erected new crucifixes along the city's perimeter. The execution ground grew by the day. Within weeks, it encircled the walls of Jerusalem like a crown of death. There was no ceremony, no trial, no mercy, just the sound of hammers and human suffering. Some were nailed by the hands, others by the wrists. A few were impaled, their bodies twisted into grotesque poses meant to shock and disgust. The Romans grew inventive. Some victims were crucified sideways, others upside down. Some were whipped first until skin sloughed from bone, then nailed through their wounds. Josephus, who stood among the Romans as a chronicler and witness, wrote, "The soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way and another after another, to the crosses by way of jest." By way of jest. That was the punchline. At the height of the horror, over 500 people were crucified each day, until there were no more trees to cut, no more crosses to build, and no space left to plant the ones already standing. The hills around Jerusalem groaned under the weight of the dead and dying. Bodies writhed under the sun, bones snapped as they hung in torment, and vultures arrived long before death finished its work. To those inside the city, these crucified figures were more than a warning. They were their brothers, their sons, their neighbors, their future. They were the message Titus wrote in blood and wood: starve inside, or die screaming outside. Crucifixion was not just death, it was ritualized degradation. It began with the scourge. Roman soldiers wielded flagra, whips embedded with bone and metal. They didn't just cut flesh, they flayed it. Victims screamed as backs turned to pulp, as ribs broke from repeated blows, as skin clung to leather thongs before tearing loose in strips. Blood painted the earth before a single nail was ever driven. Then came the burden, the patibulum, the horizontal beam, often weighing over 40 kilograms. It was strapped to the shoulders of the condemned, forcing them to stumble, half naked, through dirt and ash, past jeering soldiers and indifferent crowds, bones broken, shoulders dislocated, lungs heaving, not just from pain, but from shame. Finally, at the killing ground, the upright post stood waiting, sometimes reused, still slick with yesterday's death. The victim was thrown down. Hands or wrists were stretched and nailed, not gently, but with practiced brutality. Long iron spikes, rough and crude, driven through sinew and into wood. The feet were nailed either separately or together, depending on the executioner's mood. A crude peg, the sedile, was sometimes placed under the buttocks, not for mercy, but to prolong the agony. Without it, death came quicker by suffocation. With it, the dying could push themselves upward, gasping, prolonging the torment for hours, even days. The pain was constant and consuming. Every breath required lifting the entire body against the torn tissue of the back, scraping against rough timber. Flies laid eggs in open wounds. Birds pecked at lips and eyes. Urine and feces flowed freely, and still, death refused to come swiftly. This was not execution, it was erasure. Designed to obliterate dignity, to transform man into meat, to turn a rebel into a warning. But under Titus, crucifixion morphed into madness. Soldiers grew creative. Some lashed victims upside down. Others forced relatives to watch. A few even nailed victims to the very gates they tried to escape through, as if sealing them shut with human nails. The variation was endless, because cruelty was limitless. And all around Jerusalem these bodies hung in silence. No prayers, no burial, no last words, because by the time breath could form them, the lungs had already collapsed. Wood and iron had become scripture, written not in ink, but in agony. He did not turn away. Titus, the Roman general draped in command and polished armor, watched as the crosses rose higher than Jerusalem's walls. He stood on the hills overlooking the city, not just to survey the siege, but to survey the spectacle. This wasn't slaughter, it was theater. Every nailed limb, every strangled gasp, every twitching corpse swinging in the breeze was part of his message. Rome does not plead, Rome punishes. And the audience? Inside the city, those starving behind crumbling gates, were forced to listen. The crucifixions were not hidden in forests or tucked away in execution yards. They were arranged deliberately, publicly, horrifically. From the Temple Mount to the city gates, the skyline of Jerusalem was reshaped into a crown of blood and timber. Even the olive trees, symbols of peace, were stripped down and used to hang the condemned. Witnesses said you could smell the rot on the wind, that it clung to the breath of the city. The groans of the dying echoed through the night. Mothers clasped their children's ears. Priests offered sacrifices while the screams of crucified countrymen wailed in the background.
And Titus?
He calculated it. Each execution was policy, one more nail in the psychological coffin of Jewish resistance. He crucified not just rebels, but messengers, surrendering envoys, those suspected of aiding the escape of others. No one was spared the cross if it served Rome's terror. Even Roman soldiers, seasoned by war, began to falter. Some turned pale when given the daily orders, others drank more heavily. And yet they obeyed, because obedience was survival, and because Titus demanded it. There are records unconfirmed, but chilling, that Titus sometimes walked among the dying, that he would study them, noting how long they lasted, that he would pause beneath the crosses, silent, as if counting lessons carved into each groaning figure. He didn't need to raise his voice. The crosses did that for him. And those still holding out within the city's final strongholds, watching their future bleed out one body at a time, understood Rome would offer no terms, only timber. This was not a siege, it was a performance. And Jerusalem was the stage. When the gates finally broke, it wasn't victory, it was vengeance. In September of 70 AD, after months of siege, fire, and crucifixion, Jerusalem fell. But there were no cheers, no survivors weeping with relief. There was only flame and silence, then screaming. The temple, the heart of Jewish faith, was set alight. Gold melted between the cracks of its sacred stones. Priests were slaughtered at the altar. Blood pooled in courtyards once reserved for offerings. And then the killing spread. The Romans swept through the city like a tide of iron. Soldiers kicked down doors, tore infants from mothers' arms, cut down the elderly where they stood. Buildings were sacked, women were dragged into alleyways, children were speared without hesitation. Any who resisted were cut down. Those who collapsed from hunger were trampled. But the horror didn't end with conquest. Titus now had a city filled with prisoners, tens of thousands of hollow-eyed, half-dead survivors. He had a choice, mercy or message. He chose the cross. Those too weak to walk were killed on the spot. The rest were herded into lines, sorted like cattle. The young and strong, fit for slavery, were shackled and sold. Others were reserved for gladiatorial games, where they would be fed to beasts for the entertainment of Roman crowds. But thousands more, especially rebel fighters, their families, or simply those chosen at random, were condemned to crucifixion. The crucifixions did not stop after the siege. They increased. The roads leading out of Jerusalem became corridors of agony. Crosses lined the highways for miles, each one bearing a writhing, dying Jew. Executions took place outside the ruined gates, in the valleys, even in the shadow of the smoldering Temple Mount. The hills of Judea became graveyards, without graves. And again, no names, No prayers, no records, just screaming and silence. Then bones and silence again. It is said that some victims were crucified in front of their own homes, rooftops blackened by fire, doorways shattered, left to die facing the ashes of everything they once loved. This was not war, it was erasure. And Titus, now poised to return to Rome as a hero, made sure the lesson was absolute. Rome's message to the world was written in wood and blood. Defy the eagle, and the sky itself will betray you. Numbers are cold, unfeeling, but sometimes they scream. According to Flavius Josephus, an eyewitness to the siege, over 1.1 million people died during the Roman assault on Jerusalem. Of these, many perished from starvation, disease, or in the frenzied bloodbath that followed the final breach. But among them was a number so grotesque, so staggering, it defies comprehension: tens of thousands crucified. Not a few rebels, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands upon thousands. Rome didn't keep detailed execution logs. They didn't need to. The bodies spoke louder than scrolls. But Josephus, whose own loyalty to Rome has been questioned, still recorded what he saw with horror barely contained in ink. During the height of the siege, 500 people were crucified each day. When wood ran low, Roman engineers tore down local trees. When they ran out of crosses, they reused them, nailing new victims to the rotting remains of the old. The crucifixion wasn't an act of last resort. It was an industrial process. Jerusalem, once known for its temple and its prophets, became known for the stench of decay, for the crows, for the silence, for the wind carrying the groans of the dying like a funeral hymn across the hills of Judea. Many of the executed were not soldiers, they were civilians, traders, mothers, teenagers, anyone the Romans deemed suspicious, defiant, or simply unlucky. What's most chilling isn't just the number, it's the intent. This wasn't punishment, it was a performance of power, a spiritual annihilation. To Rome, crucifixion was never just about killing the body, it was about shattering the soul, erasing the memory, reducing rebellion to splinters and ash. And it worked. Of the once thriving Jewish population of Jerusalem, only fragments survived. Entire family lines were erased, neighborhoods turned to rubble, cultures dispersed. And in the centuries that followed, even memory began to rot, just like the bodies once nailed to those forgotten crosses. Today, we remember Golgotha, the place where one man was crucified and turned into a symbol of salvation. But in 70 AD, Golgotha was not unique. It was duplicated thousands of times. The land of prophets became a graveyard of martyrs. And the numbers, they still scream. Rome celebrated. Trumpets blared, gold glittered. Slaves wept as they dragged stolen menorahs and sacred relics through the streets of the eternal city. And at the head of this procession rode Titus victorious, laurel-crowned, adored by the masses. The year was 71 AD, and the Flavian triumph had begun. A festival to commemorate the crushing of the Jewish rebellion, a monument to Roman dominance. But beneath the cheers and marble arches, something else lingered, something not written in stone, but in silence. The trauma of a people annihilated. Titus's victory was immortalized in architecture. The Ark of Titus, still standing today, shows Roman soldiers carrying the spoils of the temple, the menorah, the trumpets, the sacred fire pans. But the arch doesn't show the crosses. It doesn't show the starved faces, the bodies nailed and left to rot, the streets of Jerusalem slick with blood and ash. There is no monument to the crucified, no plaque for the nameless dead, because their memory wasn't carved in marble. It was shattered into splinters, buried under propaganda, forgotten by design. For the Jewish people, the loss was more than physical. It was spiritual. The temple was gone, their holy city reduced to rubble, the priesthood scattered, the calendar cracked, the center of their faith erased not just by fire, but by intention. Survivors were exiled or enslaved, families torn apart, culture driven underground. What was once a vibrant civilization became a diaspora of broken voices, each one carrying a fragment of the trauma passed down through generations like a bruise that never heals. And while Titus rose in status, soon to become emperor, praised for his clemency in other parts of the empire, the people of Jerusalem mourned what could not be rebuilt, memory itself. What does it mean when history remembers the conqueror, but forgets the crucified? When the arch survives, but the agony behind it fades. This was Titus's real triumph, not just the destruction of a city, but the burial of its suffering beneath marble, myth, and time. But memory, like splinters, waits beneath the skin. And now, centuries later, we draw them out, not for revenge, not for rage, but for truth. There are no names carved in stone, no graves to tend, no last words recorded. Only this, that once, in 70 AD, the hills around Jerusalem bloomed not with olive trees or vineyards, but with crosses. Thousands of them, rising like cursed branches from the earth, each one holding the body of someone Rome wanted the world to forget. And for a time, the world did forget. Titus returned to Rome a hero. He was crowned emperor, praised for his discipline, his strategy, his supposed mercy. Monuments went up. Coins were minted. The Arch of Titus still stands in the heart of Rome, passed by tourists and politicians alike. It shows victory, glory, power, but it does not show the truth. It does not show the groaning wood, the splintered limbs, the blood that dried into the dust of Judea. It does not show the mothers who wailed, the fathers who watched their sons die in silence, the brothers crucified side by side until their skins split and their eyes dried in the sun. Those crosses are gone, burned, buried, forgotten by design. But the memory lingers in whispers, in fragments, in a truth that defies empire, that no power, no army, no emperor, no matter how vast, can erase suffering forever. It comes back, in stone, in scripture, in stories like this. Titus built a triumph, but what he really left behind was a forest of crosses, each one a monument not to Rome's greatness, but to the fragility of life beneath empire's boot. The Jewish people endured. They carried their pain across continents and centuries. They rebuilt not their temple, but their identity. And the forest, though invisible now, still stands in memory. So now we ask you, should Titus be remembered as a military genius or as an architect of genocide? Was this siege a necessary end to rebellion or a crucifixion of an entire people's soul? Tell us what you think in the comments. Subscribe for more stories history tried to bury, and let's dig them back up together. Because memory matters, even when all that's left is the shadow of a cross.